got a few minutes for Q&A. I know everybody's ready for lunch, but as chair, I get the opportunity to ask the first couple questions, and I hope you all will have some. My first question, I mean, it was interesting to see the real mix of uses and how you came up with that, but then equally interesting to see how you guys kind of stacked the uses. So David, I guess to you first, and then to the Grimshaw team, how do you decide on what the mix of uses are, and what is that journey to getting that cocktail of uses to work?
Well, I think the key thing is the flexibility, which is the thing that you guys have built into your model, was the idea that when you start out, you have no idea how you're going to end. For us, building out a master plan, which we had conceived in kind of 2002, 2003, which would not necessarily be finished until 2021. We're talking about a journey which is, you know, some of the technology that's going to be around in 2021 didn't exist when we had started out. Some of the firms that were going to be taking space didn't exist when we started out. So you have to have something that's going to be able to evolve, and your idea of being able to decide which bits you put in when and how you can kind of roll with the cycles was fundamental. And so for us, that's why we started with the space, because if you build the spaces, you've then got the opportunities. So that's opening up the opportunity for any building effectively to come along and take its place within that kind of jigsaw. So right from the very start, we had overall areas of different uses, but we hadn't designed the buildings, you know, beyond kind of sketch designs. We had areas of the site which could either what we call swing. They could be residential, they could be commercial. And it's only now in the last sort of 2 or 3 years that we've been able to be definitive about which particular buildings are going to be which particular uses. So you just roll with the market. We were incredibly lucky that Central St. Martin's came along and took that central space, the school. Now, actually, the outline planning permission said that could have been a big box of cinemas. We didn't know. Luckily, we got
At a
there.
fashion school.
So you just got to, you know, you need a bit of luck to start you off.
Okay, well, that's luck. How about science from Grimshaw's on selecting the uses?
I don't think, well, to answer your question, I don't think
Use
it
the mic.
should be, I don't think it should be for us to make those calls, actually. We're enablers, we're not social engineers. But just to go back to what David was saying, there's one thing we weighed up. We could have taken a completely different path to the one we did. We could have said, what you need is universal space that can become anything over time. In a sense, that's what Victorian warehouses in London are. You know, they're much, you know, the facades of these buildings are much loved, and they're robust, and you can beat them about and do things. And the unfortunate thing is, my reading of the difference between residential and office, it's so, the margins are so tight. If you're trying to do particularly stuff at the lower end, you can't afford the luxury of all this extra space swimming around. So that model works for, you know, executive homes on the River Thames, maybe, and we were trying to be as universal as possible. Yeah. So that's why we took the approach we did.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing fundamental for the vertical master plan is it's first of all trying to make sure a tall building can develop over time, which it doesn't do. It has to be done in one go. And then very quickly on the back of that there was obviously a very good opportunity in terms of how mixed use could follow that model as well. So it could end up being a fully commercial building, but it really is just flexible. It's supposed to be flexible enough so that it follows the market. So when the market's ready to do something, at that time you take a view, and you know. So there's a design that you have to predetermine. You have to. In our instance, we had 90 stories, and it was tapering. So whether you could do 90 stories full on, that would be fine as well. But you'd have to establish an overall framework to work within, and then you work with the market, or you react better to the market.
And maybe we'll come back to that floor plate design, because obviously the uses and the lifting and the vertical elements respond to a use type. But at the end of the table, we have Franco, who's done a building, which I think is a bit unusual, isn't it? It's a government building.
Yes.
That is how tall?
Yes, it's a government building.
Yeah, and I'm interested, did Renzo Piano decide what the building would be, or did the government decide what the building would be?
This is not the same because Renzo Piano designed for a bank. For a bank, so the bank is not totally private in Italy, but private. We can see it private. And the other building of Massimiliano Fuchs's is for the government, so the headquarters of Regione Piemonte. So the government is there. And so it's quite different, the approach, because when you have a government, and also for we are designers, in my opinion, our thought when we design a government building, this is not for a rental or, for example, for a sale, but it becomes an important factor for our city and for our nation. And so I think that from us, we have to approach this with a different aspect. So that I have designed this one for Piemonte. I've also designed for Lombardia, for the other. And my approach is to obtain a good solution and a robust solution in order to assure that this building will behave in a safe and in a good way for a long time, because otherwise I think that our task is not totally correct.
So the legacy that David talked about. Okay, we've got time for a couple questions from the audience. If anybody has any, we got a couple hands. Sorry, we're up in the spotlights up here. There we go. Tell us who you are, please.
Richard Witt from Quadrangle Architects in Toronto. Thank all of you for some really fantastic presentations. They're all really interesting. My question is more for Neven and Temoor, I think. Unfortunately, the structural one's much too complicated for an architect. The master plan that...
Think thin.
Yeah, think thin. Yes, very good. The master plan that David presented was much more, I think, understandable as a very good example of a well-done master plan. That, in a way that we're kind of familiar with. The one that the Grimshaw team proposed, obviously less so. But what David's one was all about was the public realm and the master plan, which you didn't touch on too much. And I'm wondering how you think that might be distributed throughout the project as it evolves, and also how that affects the ground plane. In Toronto, if any of you have been there recently, you'll see that we've built a lot of tall buildings in the last 10 years, probably the fastest growing city in the developed world. And we've given a lot of thought to the ground plane. There's also, before you answer the question, there's a project with the tallest residential building. It is called Aura in Toronto, and they did something very similar to what you're talking about, although that was more to unlock the opportunity for occupancy in terms of moving people in when the building was half done. Sorry, that's your question.
Guys?
You're being too harsh on us.
Yeah.
In no way did we present this to conference as a kind of completed building. And of course, there's, as I said, we'd be we're some architects under the bonnet of a building rather than actually presenting it complete. And of course, there's that whole side we haven't given much thought to. But we were, please accept it in the spirit of trying to address what, and as I said at the beginning, is a fundamental, I think, disconnect between demand and what we as an industry can supply. And that's why all of us, not just architects, engineers, construction specialists, quantity surveyors, Temoor and I have really come to believe that we are kind of in sort of prehistoric times within the world of delivering tall buildings, in not being able to deliver them in an intelligent way that is adjusted to the way demand comes forward. So that bias towards the things we concentrated on are in our presentation is a result of that. This is a skeleton of a building, not a complete building.
And just in your defense, there's a great paper out here by Stephen Ranke Architects on sky plazas, and
Well,
you did incorporate
I was
those.
going to say, if you're listening, Richard, to the presentation, I did specifically point out at the end of each phase, you create a permanent crash deck, which is there to facilitate the next phase. And the idea is that when that is then enabled, that crash deck becomes an amenity space as you go up. So part of that is important because amenity spaces off the ground need as much flat area as possible because people socialize on flat areas. That's why people in lifts just tend to look embarrassed for the most part. So this is an opportunity because you are turning, you're turning a constructional requirement into an opportunity at the end. You're creating a new address up above. I mean, so sky lobbies in principle, as you know, are in their infancy, like a lot of things in tall buildings, everything's in its infancy. But I think what has to work at the very, very ground level is the funding proposal, is the offer. How can you realize this building in one go? So, using an eating analogy, when you eat by mouthfuls. You don't shove the whole plate in your mouth. But the way we build is that. We build a great big 90-story building and just hope that it fills up in time, that we don't go bust. There's so many things, we're so used to these dangers in how we build. And I agree, I think Neven's absolutely spot on. It is, if you look at it like that, it's incredible that we build like that and we more or less get away with it. We have our economic crashes. We dust ourselves off afterwards going, Jesus, that was awful. Anyway, let's keep going. So there's a lot, in terms of gradual incremental growth, I think there's a lot to be said for it.
Very good. Other questions? There's one back here, a couple. Straight. Okay.
Keith Brewers, Grimshaw, aimed at David primarily, I think.
Oh, plant.
What, in your view, is the risk or opportunity of public realm being privately developed and privately owned? And what is the difference, I suppose, between privately owned public realm and publicly owned public realm? Going forward, the risk into the future, I suppose, because we're seeing, I think, within tall buildings, there's been a lot of talk about public space within tall buildings, which is obviously within the private realm, and you have picked up an enormous area of King's Cross and developed public realm within the private sector. But I'm just interested in predicting, I suppose, the future of that and where that leads us in terms of threats and opportunities.
I think it's an attitude, really, as to how you manage it. One of the slides which I didn't use today is when we have a little sign that says, please keep on the grass, and I think that it depends entirely. I mean, the first off, a lot of this space is space that's being created that's new. It's not space that, in a sense, is being taken out of the public realm and privatized. And all of London and a lot of the cities around, Western and most cities, have this kind of history of kind of creating new spaces and opening them up to the public. Some of which is adopted, and some of which is still owned by the great estates, whether it's the great estates in London, whether it's the Crown on Regent Street or whether it's Grosvenor or whoever. But for instance, in London, a lot of those central squares were just locked and were only allowed and used by the people who own the buildings. And our approach is completely the other way around, which is just to leave the place as open and as accessible and as free to everybody, because we believe that that's actually going to create a much more, dare I say it, democratic city. And I think that that's really, really important. And value, ultimately, because I think the people who are actually going to be, who are buying our apartments, who are working in our offices, I mean, take Google, for instance, they're going to be moving almost 7,000 or 8,000 people into King's Cross eventually when they've finished the building that they're designing, plus the two, they've taken two other buildings, space in two other buildings. Why did they choose that? Because their staff want to be in places that feel open and accessible and democratic. They don't want to be in stuffy places where if you turn up on a bike, you kind of get pushed around the back by a security guard. So That, I think, is really important. Now, how you then translate that into tall buildings and into internal spaces, and how you get access to those, it's wonderful, for instance, to be able to get up to the top of the walkie-talkie, but, you have to queue for 2 hours to get to get it or book. Similarly for the Shard, it's £10 or something like that. I don't know how much it costs to get up there. Great fun for tourists, but is it really something that people of the city will be able to go and enjoy? Stuff that you're doing in Toronto, I think, is really interesting around that. It's just opening up spaces for people to use.
Okay, we got time for one more.
This is Milind from ZA. My question is to Neven and Temoor on the presentation that they gave. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. It's a novel thought that I felt. But there's something that I want to really ask about the assumptions that you've made. The one assumption that you've made is basically your analysis was phase building compared to a build to full capacity. Did you also consider a build to full capacity but adaptable in terms of comparison? That's one question. I have a lot of questions actually because it's an interesting topic that you raised. The second question was, because of phase building, do you actually utilize the optimum GFA, that's the gross floor area efficiency, if you do a phase building compared to the build to full capacity?
Sorry, that's it. You only get two.
Oh, really?
Yeah, one was the restriction, but we'll give you two because you're a nice guy. Okay.
Okay, right, so the first one again, you're talking about adaptable. Just so I understand, you mean that you can build phase one and then adapt it, or?
No, I mean, I'm saying is you do a phased option, but then you also have a full build.
Yeah.
A build to full capacity, and then that is adaptable to the market use, basically.
I don't think that would work because you've built it. I mean, so if you've built the building, it's there. And then whether you can adapt it, you'll just be presented with the same problems, I imagine, as a normal building. So I mean, normally when a building is built, I think the developer is just looking for anyone to occupy it. And if they need to change it to residential, they will, So they'll just react to what the market will give them at that time, quite rightly, because, they're paying a lot of debt off.